What is the current state of immigration in the U.S.?
Well, what we have now is an unmitigated man-made disaster. And I say man-made because it was deliberate policies of this administration that created not necessarily the source of the problem, but the flow and the speed and the rapidity of it. And it's unmitigated in the sense that the president has elected not to use his executive powers to end it. I don't think he could ever, no president could ever 100% seal the border so that no one ever got in illegally. But if you take the average number of people that showed up were encountered at the border illegally under previous administrations, it might average 50,000 in a bad year, and now we're looking at 250,000 a month. So it is a chaotic, uncontrolled situation. Unfortunately, there's no bipartisan will to pass any kind of legislation that would control the border. You've got just completely opposing views right now. I think the leftward part of the Democratic Party is running immigration policy for them, and I think the Republican Party generally has soured on compromise because they've had it force fed to them for 3.5 years. This wreckage at the border. So I've never seen it politically as ugly as it is today. The root causes of migration really haven't changed all that much in my lifetime. There's more people, for sure. The population's grown. But it's not as if, Latin America or Asia or Africa were ever, well governed universally, or as if there were never hurricanes and floods and other natural disasters. So I think the sort of natural conditions haven't changed as much as the policies of the politicians in charge.
And what exactly has changed? Because I don't has there been any? I don't believe there's been any legislation to pass that changed things between the prior administration and this one. So how can we go? What is the actual things that have changed that would lead 50,000? Did you say per year?
I believe it was 50,000. I mean, I could get you exact numbers, but it might be, about 50,000 a year. We were seeing, a few thousand a month showing up, maybe a dozen a day. But now we're seeing thousands per day, sometimes up to 10,000 a month and, a day. And over 250. I think the worst month was like 350,000 back in December of 2023.
So really help me understand what policy change would lead to such a monumental increase. I mean, that is a staggering increase. It doesn't seem like just the executive branch's policies. Like, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, there's an absolute clear line between the policies of the Biden administration in particular and the numbers that we're seeing. So I'll give you some examples. Previous presidents in the past, I've worked for Republicans and Democrats in my career. There was a fairly universal agreement that the job of the executive branch, they swore an oath to defend and uphold the Constitution, and that means enforcing the laws. And there was disagreement about what those laws should be. There were always Democrats who were pushing for amnesties, occasionally Republicans too, for political reasons. You had Republicans, some of them, particularly the libertarian side, the sort of Chamber of Commerce people wanting higher numbers of legal immigrants to do jobs that they needed filled. But no one really debated that you had to try to enforce the laws that were in place. Occasionally that got difficult because there would be a rush at the border for one reason or another. You had the Mariel crisis with the Cubans. You've had Haiti, unfortunately, melts down about every decade on schedule. But the Clinton administration, the Carter administration, even the Obama administration, by and large, did not believe that they had the ability to waive law and allow everybody into the country. Obama famously said, it's not as if I can wave a magic wand and change the law. I have to follow the law the way it's written. President Trump, when he was faced with a surge at the border, enacted some policies that took away the sort of immediate benefit that people coming to the border illegally want. And you have to remember that of the population that shows up at the border, the vast majority are there for a job. They live in countries that are less wealthy than the U.S., where there are fewer opportunities, maybe bad government, and they want to come here and get a job. You can't blame them for wanting that. Very few of them are actually fleeing for reasons that would allow them political asylum under our law, which is based on the Geneva Convention of 1951. So when you have people showing up, what do they want? They want to get in to the country. They want to be able to stay. They want to be able to send money home. They want to be able to work, and then they want to bring their families to join them. They want those 5 things. So if you give them those 5 things, word gets out and they're going to come and stay. And they don't really care about the mechanics of it, the policies, the asylum process. What matters to people coming for economic reasons is, can they get in, work, stay, send money home, and eventually send for their families? So the Trump administration made an effort to send the signal out that, yes, of course, our laws haven't changed and people can claim asylum under certain circumstances, but we are not going to release every single person who shows up and says that they're fleeing political persecution into the country, into a backlog that's now upwards of 3 million cases that could last 10, 15 years before a decision is made. And even when it's made, they're unlikely to be deported because by that time they've got kids and roots, and there'll be multiple appeals. And we know that once people are released into the country, the percentage that are deported, even with a valid order from a judge, plummets down from like 98% if they're detained down to 20% for individuals and as low as 2% for unaccompanied children. So the Trump administration enacted something called Remain in Mexico. The Migrant, it wasn't called Remain in Mexico, it's called the Migrant Protection Protocols, but people know it as Remain in Mexico. And what that said was, if you come to the border illegally and you claim asylum, you say, I can't go home to Venezuela or Cameroon because I will be persecuted by the government. We said, okay, you can lodge your application and we'll let you go through with it. You'll have your day in court and your hearing, but you have to wait in Mexico outside the United States until we decide your case, because if we let you in, then you've already got the 5 things you want, and then you might not bother to show up for the second hearing. And that happens all the time. People come in under the pretext of claiming asylum. They are released into the country. I call it process, parole, and punt. And they're released into the Mayorkas migration machine. They get a ticket to go to New York or Chicago or L.A. They get a notice to appear in court, maybe a month, 3 months, 6 months down the line. Half of them don't bother to show up to that first hearing because they've already got what they wanted and they know they don't really have an asylum claim. Some of them bother to show up for the first hearing, but then not the second or the third, or they keep showing up until it becomes obvious that they're not going to win their case, and then they stop showing up. And sometimes they even show up for the final case. The judge says, you're ordered removed, and they say, thank you very much, and then they go home, and no one ever comes to pick them up to remove them. There are 7.4 million cases on ICE's, this is Immigration and Customs Enforcement's, non-detained docket. That means people in deportation proceedings who are just running around the country perfectly happy, working, doing whatever it is they want to do. So, this system has been overwhelmed. The legal immigration system and the asylum system have just been crushed by a wave of economic migrants because President Biden undid the migrant protection protocols. He said, stop building the wall. He said, I will not detain children. I will release everybody. So you had family groups showing up with children. You had the same children being recycled, several times through the system.
What is
there was no effort really.
Stop. Go back for a sec. When you say children being recycled through the system, what do you mean by that?
Well, at one point, they were doing DNA tests. I worked overseas doing visa interviews, and the fraud level is unbelievably high. People would show up and say, this is my kid. And if you did a DNA test, it was one way to be sure that they were or they weren't. And just the mere threat that you're going to do a DNA test will convince some people it's not worth, wasting the time and taking the gamble. But they stopped doing that. So you would have a so-called family show up. And now some of them actually were mother, father, kid. But sometimes it was an uncle or a cousin or just a relative that the cartel would put together into a package because there's a court decision called Flores. It's kind of a long story, but it means that the government cannot detain children for longer than about 21 days. And if you're traveling with a child, the same judge that decided that in 2015 said anyone who's a family member or traveling with that child gets into that package, so they're released in 21 days. So it became a huge incentive to travel with a child. And there are many instances of Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol recognizing a kid and saying, wait a minute, I just saw that kid 2 days ago. And so that's what I mean by recycling. I wouldn't say that's a majority of cases, but it definitely happens. Child trafficking is one of the easiest ways to get into the United States.
What happens to these children who are packaged together with either family members or even non-family members? I mean, the mind goes quickly to pretty dark places when you talk about kids that are being used as a tool.
Well, if the children are coming in with their actual families, then you would hope that the families are going to take care of them through whatever immigration processes they go through. There's a court decision in the U.S. that says that all public schools have to basically accept all children, regardless of immigration status. So the kids, and they'll get federal health care benefits and various other things. So the ones that come in legitimate families, at least from a health and welfare point of view, are probably fine. The ones who are much more vulnerable are those who come in as minors, the so-called UACs, unaccompanied alien children. And I think so far the number under President Biden is it's approaching 500,000. So we're talking about 500,000 unaccompanied children. Some of them, a few of them, are actually over 18 and just claiming to be under 18. Let's say they're gang members from MS-13 or Tren de Aragua, and they want to get in under the easier regime. We've seen that happening. But a lot of them are actually minors. And what happens is they go into if they are from contiguous countries, so that's Mexico and Canada, they can be expelled. They can be removed just like adults. But if they are from anywhere further south, there's nowhere further north of Canada on this continent, but if they're from Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, then they are released into the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this agency is still in charge of actual refugee resettlement, meaning people who've gone through the actual formal American refugee process overseas, and then they try to give them a head start, housing, hook them up in the neighborhood and get them on their way to becoming Americans. But they've kind of been shoehorned into this responsibility because no one else was able to take it on. And they essentially release these children to ideally a family member. But if they can't find one, then just some adult to whom the kid claims to have some kind of relationship. And unfortunately, some of those relationships are not good. We're talking about kids working in meat packing plants, prostitution, backbreaking labor that our law forbids, maybe to pay off the loan that their families took out to get them here, or for other nefarious purposes. So what's happening to the unaccompanied children is one of the sadder results of this border crisis.
I want to take a step back and hear how you paint the bigger picture of immigration in America, more from a historical perspective. So, we met a while, earlier this year, and we were talking about this issue, and and I tend to be more like pro-immigration. You could say I'm a delusional libertarian type, but aren't we a nation of immigrants? Isn't this just America being America, and send us your unwashed masses and all of that? Like, isn't letting even in sheer volume numbers, isn't this just like what happened at Ellis Island at the turn of the century, where you have boats filled with Italians and Irish and et cetera, et cetera? Place what's happening now in the bigger context of the history of immigration in America.
Well, I had a slide on this for one of the presentations that I give, and I wish I could remember the exact figure. But the number that came into Ellis Island per day was significantly smaller than the number that's coming in illegally now over the border per day. And if you look at the entire number that came in to Ellis Island over all the years that it was open, I believe it's fewer than were encountered at the border just under the Biden administration alone. So, the population of the world in, let's say, 1880 was less than half of what it is now. You couldn't just get on a plane and fly to Nicaragua and walk your way up to the U.S. border. So the mechanics of immigration are much, much easier. The populations of, I'll just give you an example. My grandmother was born in India. And when she was born, the population of India was about 300 million people. And now the population of India is about 1.5 billion people. Mm-hmm. So it's gone up by 5 times. I've been there. It's a wonderful country in many ways, but it is full. You see people living in ways that no American would ever contemplate living. I remember getting up at 5:30 in the morning once to catch a train out of New Delhi, and lining the railroad tracks going out for about 2 miles were people taking their morning dump because that was the only place they could go. Like every 5 feet, there was someone squatting down. And I just thought, wow, this is a really crowded city. So the demographics of the world have changed enormously. And while I absolutely, I think everybody on my side of this debate who's in favor of enforcing the laws agrees that immigration is a part of U.S. history and a part of our future and is by and large a good thing for the country. We also accept the reality that the demand for entry into the U.S. exceeds the supply. And, I think I love drinking wine, and sometimes I drink too much. But if you have a glass of wine or a couple glasses at dinner, that's probably just fine. But if you have 2 or 3 bottles at breakfast, that long term is going to catch up with you. And I think immigration's the same thing. It's a good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. And I was listening to the Bill Maher's show last week, and he was trying to pin down his guests to, what would be too many? Like, is there a point at which there are too many people coming in to the United States? And he basically concluded that any answer short of infinity made you a racist and a xenophobe. But the reality is, this society is complicated, and there are limits to what we can absorb in the space of a year or even 10 years. If you look at our schools, if you look at our hospitals, if you look at our services, when you're talking about people who are, generally speaking, low-skilled, I'm talking about illegal immigrants, low-skilled, and don't speak English and may have healthcare needs, they tend to take a lot more services in the beginning than they contribute. So there are, I think, just logistical and societal limits to the number of people that can be absorbed. I think if you go down the ultra-libertarian route, the sort of, my Cato friends on the other side of this would say, let them all in, eventually it sorts out. And
Right.
They're absolutely right, but I don't think it sorts out until, we start to look like Caracas or Calcutta, and I'm not sure that most Americans are willing to take that hit to their standard of living.
So I want to challenge that, but I want to understand it because I am not as doctrinaire as my libertarian friends at Cato on this. I don't feel like I understand it well enough. In real terms, like being physically in these places and seeing what happens when millions of people come into the country and gather together, it seems like Europe has handled this in different ways than the U.S. in that immigrants there seem to end up in ghettos. Is there something about the way the U.S. integrates people, even at this scale, that's better than other countries, better than France? You go to France and you're Muslim and you basically get shunted to a ghetto and end up being in this, culturally separated environment. That's my impression. Is that true? Like, how do we do at absorbing, even with the challenge of the volume? How do we do at absorbing immigrants relative to other countries?
Well, I could kick back a little bit on the France part because I lived there for about 8 years. But in the United States, we had a couple of real advantages. First of all, we're huge, and we were not settled in the first 150 years to any degree. The native population was through disease and warfare wiped out from a high of maybe 20 million down to a fraction of that. And so a lot of the country was sort of wide open for farming, for settlements. So you had communities of, Germans and Swedes and Danes and Eastern European Jews and Italians and whatever that would just, go off to various parts of the country, start their own communities, and then eventually sort of integrate. And we did in the beginning have I wouldn't, ghetto is a term from Venice, where they had a special island where all the Jews lived. But we use that term to mean it's kind of pejorative, a group of people of one ethnicity. But let's just call them an ethnic enclave. I had one of the guys working at my school when I was a kid. He grew up in a part of Trenton, New Jersey, that was a little Italy. Everybody was Italian. People spoke Italian. They ate Italian food. They went to Catholic church. Then his son became a screenwriter out in Hollywood. So that's just a little tiny microcosm of what tended to happen. People, with the exception of the Amish and maybe the Hasidic Jews, who are still very much together, most people, after a generation or two, they may have started in an all-Irish or all-German or all-Italian neighborhood, but they grew up, they got jobs, they went other places in the country, and they mixed up and they integrated. And I still think that force is powerfully at work. You're seeing that in the so-called Hispanic community, which of course is a very varied community with nothing in common other than the census decided to put them in the same category back in the 70s. But you see people from the second and third generation from Latin America going all over the country and doing whatever it is that they want to do. So I think that's a powerful engine that we have. Europe is constrained by demography, by geography as well as demography. It's pretty much all settled. So if you come in from Algeria or Morocco in the 1960s, 70s, and up to today, it's not like you can just start a village in the middle of nowhere. You've got to go somewhere, and you tend to go where you know people, where they speak your language, and you start there. But there are plenty of French immigrants who've made it out of wherever they started and settled all over the country. But I do think we have an advantage. It's also part of our culture. We believe that we're a country of immigrants. That's what our history tells us. And so there's a positivity to it that may not be there in European countries that have had to struggle for nationhood, maybe had a couple wars over it, and still see themselves as an ethnically distinct people.
If you like this clip, we've got so much more where that came from. So be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss our new videos as they come out each week.